Pack your boxes or I'll do it for you. That's what my mother said, her voice flat and cold, the way a woman talks when she's already decided she doesn't care how the sentence lands. She was standing in the doorway of my childhood bedroom in Naperville, Illinois, arms crossed over her chest, wearing the beige cardigan she always put on when she wanted to look reasonable while doing something cruel. I was 22 years old. My sister Vanessa was leaning against the hallway wall behind her, inspecting her nails, a small smile barely held back at the corners of her mouth. And my father, Richard, 61 years old at the time, was sitting in his recliner in the living room downstairs, far enough away that he could pretend he hadn't heard, close enough that he absolutely had. I stood there for a moment in that room that still had the same glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling I'd stuck up there when I was 9, and I felt something crack open inside me that I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to close, but I didn't cry. I looked at my mother. I looked at my sister. I picked up my grandmother's old brass compass from the nightstand, the one Grandma Loretta had left specifically to me in a handwritten note my parents had always pretended didn't exist, and I put it in my jacket pocket. Then I started filling boxes. They thought that was me giving up. They had no idea it was me beginning. How do you explain to someone who hasn't lived it what it feels like to be the wrong daughter in a family of 2? Not the overlooked one in a crowd of siblings, not lost in some chaotic household where nobody gets enough attention. I mean specifically, surgically, deliberately the wrong one. The one who gets compared unfavorably to the same person at breakfast, dinner, and every holiday in between. The one who is held up against her sister like a painting next to a mirror and told every time that she is the painting, meaning lesser, meaning static, meaning a thing that doesn't reflect what the family wants to see of itself. My name is Claire Renata Holloway. I was born on March 9th in a suburb of Chicago where the lawns are always manicured and the garages hold cars that cost more than some people's educations, and where, if you look at any family from the outside, everything appears to be fine. My parents, Richard and Deb Holloway, ran a mid-sized landscaping and property management company that Richard had built over 30 years. By the time I was in high school, the business grossed somewhere around $2 million a year. We lived in a 4,000-square-foot house. My sister and I both had our own bedrooms, our own bathrooms, our own cars when we turned 17. From the outside, we were a successful American family. We had the right lawn, we had the right church, we had the portraits above the fireplace. What we had behind the portraits was a different story. Vanessa is 4 years older than me. She is 38 now, which means she was 38 when she learned what her silence had cost her. But I'll get to that. Growing up, Vanessa was effortlessly the golden child in the way that some people are effortlessly beautiful, not because they work at it, but because the room has decided it for them. She was social, cheerful, the kind of girl who remembered everyone's birthday and called teachers by their first names and got away with it. My father called her Nessie, and my mother braided her hair on Sunday mornings. I was Claire, just Claire, no nickname. My father shook my hand at my high school graduation like I was a client. It started as the small things always do. I got a B- in 7th grade math and Vanessa had gotten an A, so my mother taped Vanessa's test to the refrigerator and asked me what I planned to do differently. I joined the school newspaper at 13, and by 15, I had written a piece that got picked up by the local Naperville Sun. My mother mentioned it once at dinner, and then asked if Vanessa had told them about her new part in the spring musical. I got into the University of Illinois at Chicago on a partial academic scholarship. Vanessa had gone to DePaul, which was more expensive, and my father paid for it without blinking. My scholarship was met with, well, it covers some of it, so what's your plan for the rest? My plan, as it turned out, was to take on $26,000 in student loans, while my sister had her tuition entirely covered by our parents. I never asked for parity. I had learned by then that asking was a way of being told what you were worth, what nobody in my family knew, what I had not yet told them because I was still figuring out how to say it without it being used against me, was that I had not dropped out of college because I was lazy. I had dropped out because I was building something. But Vanessa told them before I could, and she told them wrong. The landscaping company my father ran had a significant technology problem by the time I was 21. They were managing accounts on paper logs and a software system built in the early 2000s that crashed twice a month and could not handle the scale of their client roster. I had been watching this for years. I was studying information systems and had spent 2 semesters building, on my own time, a custom client management platform designed specifically for mid-sized property services businesses. I had a working prototype. I had shown it to a professor who told me to get it in front of investors before I showed it to anyone else. I had a meeting in February of that year with a small venture group in River North that was interested in a licensing deal. That meeting required me to have something fully operational and documented, which required my complete focus for approximately 4 months. So I took a medical leave of absence from classes, a formal leave, registered with the university, with a return date already scheduled, and I poured everything into finishing the platform. I did not call it dropping out because it was not dropping out. It was a calculated decision to prioritize the thing that was generating real momentum over the thing that could wait a semester. Vanessa found out about the leave through a mutual friend and called my mother before she called me. She did not ask me what was happening. She did not text me. She picked up the phone and she told my parents that I had walked away from school because I couldn't handle the pressure, that I had always been the flaky one, that she was worried about me but wasn't surprised. My mother's exact words when she called me the same afternoon were, "Your sister is concerned about you." And then, "This is a disgrace, Claire. You have always been a disgrace." She didn't raise her voice. She said it the way someone reads a diagnosis, just confirming what was already known. My father got on the phone briefly. He said, "We should have known." Then he handed the phone back to my mother. I did not explain myself that night. I was shaking so hard I had to set the phone face down on the table and breathe through my mouth for a full 2 minutes before I could pick it back up. The apartment I was renting in Wicker Park was 1,100 square feet of secondhand furniture and extension cords and whiteboards covered in system architecture diagrams, and it smelled like the Thai takeout I'd been surviving on and the coffee that had been sitting on the burner for too many hours. I was 21 years old, and I had been awake for 31 consecutive hours, and my mother had just told me, clearly and without hesitation, that I was a disgrace to my family. And my sister had handed her the ammunition to say it. I want to be honest about what happened next because I think people who tell stories like this often skip the part where they fell apart before they stood up. I did fall apart. I cried for about 2 hours. Then I made coffee, opened my laptop, and worked until 4 in the morning. Because the thing about that moment was that it did something unexpected. It clarified. All of the ambient, chronic pain of being the wrong daughter in that family, the years of comparisons, the loans while my sister's tuition got paid, the handshake at graduation, the refrigerator with her test and not mine, it crystallized into something I could hold in my hand like a stone. A specific weight, a specific temperature, cold and hard and useful. I did not call my parents back that night. I did not call Vanessa. I opened a document on my computer, and I started writing down every instance I could remember, going back as far as I could access clearly, of financial inequity, emotional dismissiveness, and deliberate exclusion. I dated each entry as precisely as I could. I noted witnesses where they existed. I did not know yet exactly what I was going to do with the document, but I knew I was going to need it. The venture meeting happened in March. The licensing deal was offered in May. By my 22nd birthday, I had signed a contract worth a first-year licensing fee of $140,000, with revenue share on every new client the platform onboarded. The platform was called Groundwork Pro. It was good. It still is. I did not tell my parents. I went back to school in the fall and finished my degree quietly, because I had already decided that when I showed my parents what I had built, the degree would be one more thing they couldn't take credit for, completed on my own timeline, for my own reasons, after I had already done the thing they'd told me I was too flaky to do. Meanwhile, my parents continued telling the family that I had dropped out. They didn't tell people about the leave of absence. They didn't correct the story when my aunt or my uncle or the neighbors asked how Claire was doing. The version they allowed to exist, the one my sister had delivered and my parents had adopted, was that I was the daughter who couldn't handle college, while Vanessa had graduated and was now working in marketing and dating a man from the North Shore, whom my mother described as a wonderful young man every single time his name came up. This is the part of the story where I want you to understand something about the geography of family silence. My extended family, my father's brother, my mother's sister, the cousins, the neighbors who had watched us grow up, they all knew the Holloway family. They knew Richard, who built his business from nothing, Deb, who organized the church fundraiser every spring, Vanessa, who was so poised and warm and put together, and they knew Claire, the younger one, the one who had some trouble, who just couldn't seem to get it together the way Vanessa did. Nobody was saying I was a bad person. They were just not saying anything that challenged the picture my parents had painted. And my parents knew how to paint. My father had a talent for presenting himself in exactly the light he needed. At church, he was generous. At the country club in Burr Ridge, he was sharp and collegial. At neighborhood events, he was the man who always had the right handshake, the right anecdote, the right amount of self-deprecating humor to keep everyone comfortable. He had built a reputation in the western suburbs over 30 years that was real currency. People trusted Richard Holloway. He had 4 employees, and then 12, and then, at its peak, the company had 29 people on payroll. He knew how to project stability. What he had quietly done over the years, which I didn't fully understand until I started really looking, was use that stability as a lever. Not overtly. Not the kind of thing you could point to in a single moment and say there, that's the abuse. It was structural, layered. American in the specific way that financial control in family systems tends to be. You don't cage the bird, you just make very sure that it believes it cannot fly without you. My student loans were $26,000, which was real money for a 21-year-old. Vanessa's education had been paid in full. The understanding in our house, never formally stated but always precisely enforced, was that financial support from my parents came with conditions, and those conditions were about compliance. You lived where they were comfortable with. You made decisions they could publicly sanction. You presented as a Holloway at family functions, and you did not cause scenes, and you absolutely did not question. When I was younger, I had once pushed back on something small. I was 17. I'd gotten a job at a coffee shop in town, and my father had said, "We don't need you working. It makes it look like we can't provide for you." And my mother had taken me aside afterward and told me that when I was in my father's house, his preferences were not requests. I was 17 years old. His preferences were not requests. I have thought about that sentence probably 1,000 times since then. The job at the coffee shop was the kind of thing I had done not because we needed the money, but because I needed autonomy. I needed to know I could earn something that was mine. My father did not understand that distinction, or he understood it perfectly, which is why he objected. By the time I was in my early 20s and the platform deal was signed, I was financing my own life entirely. I paid for school. I paid for my apartment. I bought my own car, a used 2017 Honda Civic with 114,000 miles on it, which I drove until the odometer crossed 161,000. I did not ask my parents for anything, but I also had not fully severed. I still came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. I still sat at the table where my father said grace and my mother served the green bean casserole, and Vanessa told a story and everyone laughed, and I ate my food and smiled at the appropriate moments and drove the 90 minutes home on the I-88 feeling hollowed out in a way I couldn't fully name. This is the thing about family systems built around a controlling parent. They do not need you to participate actively in your own diminishment. They just need you to keep showing up. Your presence, even your silent presence, is a form of endorsement. Every Thanksgiving you sit through, every Christmas you absorb, every Easter where you bite your tongue is one more data point in the family ledger that says, this is acceptable, that everything here is normal, that Claire is fine, I was not fine. I was building something and surviving on takeout and not sleeping enough and carrying $26,000 in debt and watching my sister receive a fully funded life while being told, periodically, that I was a disgrace. But I was there. I kept being there. And for too long, that felt like the only option. There is a specific kind of gaslighting that happens in American families with a controlling father when the daughter dares to name what's actually happening. It has a very particular script. You say, "Dad, it feels like the support isn't equal," and he says, "I gave you a roof and food and clothes for 18 years. What exactly are you complaining about?" You say, "I feel like Vanessa is treated differently," and your mother says, "Your sister worked hard and you've made different choices. That's not favoritism." You say, "When I tried to explain about the leave of absence, neither of you asked questions," and your father says, "You always have an excuse, Claire. We're just tired of excuses." And somewhere in the repetition of that pattern, you start, just slightly, against your will, to wonder if they're right. Not fully, not completely, but enough to keep you quiet for a little while longer. My father's particular genius was that he never had to raise his voice very much. He had a low, measured tone he used when he was delivering a verdict, and he said things like, "I'm just being honest with you because nobody else will, and I hope someday you understand I'm saying this for your own good." He said, "We just expect more from you because we know you're capable." That one is the most insidious. The suggestion that high expectations are love, that withholding approval is a form of investment in you. I believed it longer than I should have. Long enough that when I started writing the document, going back through years of incidents and noting them down, I was still fighting a voice in my head that said, "But he does love you in his way. You're being ungrateful. You are being dramatic." It took me a while to realize that voice was not my own. It was his. I had been so thoroughly trained to argue against myself that I could not easily tell the difference between my thoughts and the thoughts I had absorbed from the men and women who raised me. There is a woman named Priya Anand who changed my life, and the funny thing is, she never tried to. We met at a tech networking event in the West Loop in the spring, about a year after the platform deal closed, and she was a contract attorney who had started doing intellectual property work for early-stage software companies. We were talking about something innocuous, licensing terms or revenue structures, and at some point I must have said something that gave away more than I intended, because she looked at me directly and asked, "Do you have any of this documented?" She wasn't asking about business contracts. She was asking about my family. I'm still not sure how she knew. I think I must have been carrying it in the way I talked about money. That particular combination of careful precision and barely suppressed fury that shows up when someone has been financially wronged for long enough that they've started cataloging it. I told her I had some notes. She told me to make them more thorough. She gave me her card. She said, "Not as your attorney, just as a person. Keep writing it down, and when you're ready to understand what your options are, call me." I kept her card in the same pocket where I kept Grandma Loretta's compass. The document grew. It was not a dramatic thing. It was quiet and methodical, and it happened in small increments over about 2 years. In the late hours after work, when I'd close my laptop and open the other file and add whatever had happened most recently, with specificity. The Christmas my father told the extended family that Claire had some setbacks in school, right in front of me. The Easter where my mother mentioned to my aunt that Vanessa had always been the more driven one. The phone call in September when my father told me that he'd heard my platform was doing okay, and that maybe if I'd stayed in school properly, I'd have done even better. A comment designed to strip any pride from an achievement I had built entirely on my own. The fact that Vanessa had received a down payment of $45,000 from my parents for a condo in Lincoln Park, a transfer I only learned about because I happened to see a bank statement my mother had left out on the kitchen counter one Christmas, and that I had never been offered anything comparable. Not a conversation about it, not an explanation. The document was not a diary. It was a record. There is a difference. A diary is about feeling. A record is about facts. Priya helped me understand the facts. She had, through her work, referrals to 2 people who became important. The first was Howard Kessler, a financial forensics consultant in Schaumburg who specialized in family business disputes, and who was, frankly, terrifying in the most reassuring way I had ever experienced. He was 57, heavy-set, wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses in every meeting, and he had the affect of someone who had spent so long looking at numbers that he had achieved a kind of permanent calm. He said things like, "Let's see what the money says," with the confidence of someone who knew the money was going to say exactly what he needed it to say. The second person was a therapist named Dr. Patricia Osei, based in Evanston, who had a specific practice background in adult survivors of emotionally controlling family systems, and who, in our 3rd session, said something that I have not forgotten since. She said, "Claire, you have spent 20-plus years arguing against yourself on your family's behalf. The thing you need to understand is that you can stop any time. The case is already closed. The verdict was in before you were born. The only question is whether you keep showing up to a court that was never going to rule in your favor, or whether you build your own court." I told Priya and Howard what I had. Priya looked at the document. At that point, it was 41 pages of single-spaced notes, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're meticulous." I said, "I had to be." She said, "Yes, I know." Howard started pulling public records and business documents. My father's company, Holloway Property Services, had been operating for 31 years, and like many family businesses of that scale in Illinois, it had a complicated internal financial architecture that looked clean from the outside, but had, over time, developed some structures that were considerably harder to explain in the light of scrutiny. Howard found 3 things in the first 2 weeks that he presented to me in a folder on a Wednesday evening in his office in Schaumburg, with a cup of terrible coffee in a styrofoam cup, the kind that tastes like the cup more than the coffee. He set the folder on the table between us and opened it without ceremony. The first thing was that Grandma Loretta's estate, which had been administered by my father after she passed when I was 19, had included a trust provision for both Vanessa and me of $35,000 each. I had never received mine. No distribution had ever been made to me. Howard had the trust document, obtained through public probate records in DuPage County, and the distribution log, which showed Vanessa's disbursement and a notation beside my name that said distribution pending, dated 11 years ago. 11 years of pending. The second thing was that my father had, over the past 8 years, transferred a cumulative total of approximately $212,000 from the business operating account to a personal account held only in his name, in disbursements that were recorded in the business books as contractor payments, but for which there were no corresponding contractor invoices or tax filings. This was not a rounding error. This was methodical. Small enough in individual increments, between $3,000 and $18,000 at a time, that it had not triggered anything, but consistent, and very, very documentable. The third thing was smaller but personally specific in a way that hit me differently than the numbers. Howard had found a property in my name, a small rental property in Plainfield, Illinois, that my grandmother had apparently deeded to me when I was 17, before she died, not after, as part of a direct gift outside the estate. A property that my father, as my legal guardian at the time and the person who had handled the paperwork, had allowed to be managed through the family business without my knowledge, collecting rental income on it for 7 years after I had turned 18, without ever informing me of its existence or transferring the income to me. There was a 2-bedroom house in Plainfield in my name that I had not known existed. It had been generating approximately $1,400 a month in rent for 7 years. That's $117,600 conservatively that had flowed through my father's business accounts with my name on the deed, and not a single dollar of it disclosed to me. I sat in Howard's office for a long time after he stopped talking. The fluorescent light above us buzzed slightly. Someone in another office down the hall was on a call, their voice too muffled to make out words. I was looking at the folder and I was thinking about the compass in my jacket pocket, the brass one Grandma Loretta had left me. I was thinking about a handwritten note that said for my Claire, because she will always find her way. I was thinking about a woman who had tried to leave me things and a man who had quietly taken them. My hands were very still. I am aware of when my hands are still because it doesn't happen when I'm upset. I have a habit of moving when I'm anxious, touching things, adjusting. When my hands are still, it means something has resolved inside me. I said to Howard, "What do we do first?" He said, "We make sure everything is documented perfectly, and then we let you decide how far you want to take it." I told him I wanted to take it as far as it goes. He nodded. He closed the folder. He said, "All right, let's begin." Priya began the formal legal process that October. The first step was a demand letter to my father through his attorney of record. She had located his business attorney, a man named Gary Pratt, who operated out of a firm in Downers Grove, citing the undistributed estate trust disbursement, the unauthorized rental property income, and the business account discrepancies, and requesting a full accounting within 30 days. We were not going to court yet. We were establishing a paper trail and giving my father the opportunity to respond, which Priya predicted he would use to further incriminate himself. His response, she explained, would tell us everything about how he intended to handle this. She was right. His response, delivered through Gary Pratt approximately 3 weeks after our letter, was a 4-paragraph document that said, in summary, that the trust disbursement had been delayed because of estate complications and that my father had intended to discuss it with me personally, that the property in Plainfield had been managed on my behalf, and that my father had been holding the rental income in trust for me and could provide an accounting, and that the business account transfers were contractor payments that were improperly categorized and would be corrected. 3 lies, each one documentable as a lie. The trust disbursement had not been delayed for administrative reasons. 11 years had passed. No outreach had ever been made to me. Howard had the distribution records. The rental income my father claimed to be holding in trust for me did not exist in any account with my name on it. Howard had looked. There was no trust account. There was no earmarked fund. There was a general business account from which money had regularly been withdrawn. The contractor payments were not improperly categorized. They had been categorized with specific contractor names, 2 of which were shell entities Howard had traced back to my father through registered agent records filed in Illinois. Priya read the response and called me. She said, "He's lying, which means he knows he's caught, which means he's scared. We file." There was a Thursday evening in November, about 3 weeks before Priya filed the civil complaint in DuPage County, when Vanessa called me. We had spoken perhaps 4 times in the preceding year, brief surface conversations where neither of us addressed anything real. This call was different. I could tell from the first 2 seconds because she was not doing the breezy, performative warmth she usually deployed. She was quiet on the first beat. And then she said, "Dad told me you're making trouble." Making trouble. I was 33 years old and I had filed a demand letter about money that was legally mine, and my father had called it making trouble. I said, "What did he tell you?" She said, He said you hired some people to look into the business and that you're trying to get money from him. He's really upset, Claire. He's really upset. I held the phone very still against my ear, and I looked at the whiteboard across from my desk, which still had some old architecture notes on it, and I thought about being 21 in this same apartment and crying for 2 hours and then getting back to work. And I thought about every Christmas and every Easter and every telephone call where I had swallowed what was happening and smiled and continued. I thought about Grandma Loretta's compass. I thought about a house in Plainfield I hadn't known existed. I said, Vanessa, I'm going to need you to understand something. What's happening is not me making trouble. What's happening is me addressing real legal violations. I'm not doing it to hurt Dad. I'm doing it because what he did was wrong and it caused real damage to me. She was quiet. I said, I'd like your support, but I'm going to proceed either way. She said, He's our father, Claire. There it was. He's our father. The ancient, all-purpose override. The sentence that has been used to excuse more than it should ever have been permitted to excuse in the history of families. I had heard its cousin 100 times. After everything he's done for you, you know he loves you in his way. He has his faults, but he means well. And every time it was a door closing in my face dressed up as an invitation to understand. I said, Yes, he is. Good night, Vanessa. I hung up, and I made myself a cup of tea. English breakfast, no sugar, because I had been making it that way since graduate school, and the familiarity of the ritual helped me think. And I sat at my kitchen table and I let myself feel what I felt, which was a specific kind of grief that I had been slowly composting for years. Not grief for the father I'd lost. Grief for the father I had never quite been able to stop hoping I might someday have. The one who would have said, I see you, I know what you built, I am proud. That father did not exist and had never existed, and the sooner I was completely done grieving him, the better. I finished my tea, I washed the cup, I went to bed, and I slept 8 hours, which was more than I had slept in a single stretch in about 2 months. Priya filed the civil complaint in late November. It named my father in 3 separate causes of action: breach of fiduciary duty related to the estate trust, conversion of the rental property income, and fraudulent misrepresentation in the business accounting. Howard had produced a financial forensics report that was 47 pages long and documented every transaction, every discrepancy, every shell contractor entity, with dates, account numbers, and cross-references to corporate registration filings. It was thorough in the way that leaves no comfortable middle ground. You either explain every item, or you can't. The world did not immediately end for my father after the filing. Legal processes in Illinois take time. But the filing was a matter of public record, which meant that anyone who knew how to look could find it. And in a community like Naperville, in a professional network like the one my father had spent 30 years building, the existence of a civil complaint filed by your own daughter had a gravity that didn't require headlines. Gary Pratt called Priya within a week requesting a settlement conference. My father, it turned out, did not want this to proceed to discovery. Of course he didn't. The settlement conference happened in January at a neutral attorney's office in Wheaton. I wore a dark blue blazer over a gray turtleneck, and I carried a leather portfolio that Priya had given me the previous Christmas, and I walked into that conference room and sat down across from my father for the first time in 8 months. He was 63 years old, and he looked it in a way he hadn't the last time I'd seen him. He had lost weight in his face. His eyes moved around the room rather than settling. Gary Pratt sat beside him, and 2 paralegals were arranged along the side table with documents in accordion folders. My father looked at me once when I walked in and then looked at his hands. I sat down. Priya opened her portfolio. Howard, who was appearing as our expert witness consultant, opened his. I looked at my father and I said nothing because there was nothing I needed to say. Everything had already been said. Priya had said it in 47 documented pages. The conference was 3 hours and 12 minutes long. I know the exact duration because I looked at my watch when we sat down and again when we stood to leave. In that 3 hours and 12 minutes, my father's attorney attempted 4 separate alternative explanations for the documented discrepancies, each of which Priya and Howard dismantled with specific documentary evidence before Gary Pratt finished forming the sentence. They tried to reframe the trust disbursement as a bookkeeping oversight that had been waiting to be corrected. Priya produced 11 years of bank records and 0 communications initiating a correction. They tried to argue that the rental property income had been applied toward costs of property management. Howard produced the management cost records from the business and showed that the property had been managed for an average annual cost of approximately $6,000, against an annual rental income of $16,800, leaving an unexplained surplus of $10,800 per year for 7 years, $75,600 of unaccounted funds. They tried to argue the contractor payments were legitimate. Howard named the shell entities, gave the registered agent addresses, and showed that 2 of the 3 supposed contractors had no business presence, no tax filings, and shared a registered agent address with one of my father's personal holdings. At approximately the 2-hour mark, Gary Pratt asked for a recess. He and my father stepped out of the room for 22 minutes. When they came back, Gary Pratt said that his client was prepared to discuss a resolution. My father did not look at me when they came back in. He sat down, and he looked at the table, and his jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was containing something he didn't have the vocabulary or the will to let out. I had seen that jaw set 100 times in my life, and I knew exactly what it contained. Not remorse, not understanding, but the cold arithmetic of a man calculating what it would cost him not to do this math. The resolution that was eventually signed 3 weeks later, after additional negotiation that I will not fully detail here, included the following: a payment to me of $297,000, representing the $35,000 estate trust disbursement with interest, $75,600 in unaccounted rental income, and the remaining balance representing a portion of the business account discrepancies for which Howard had been able to document clear diversion. The full settlement agreement also included a formal transfer of the Plainfield property, valued at the time of settlement at $238,000, back to my sole and clear ownership without encumbrance. My father agreed to a structured repayment plan for the settlement amount because he did not have $297,000 in liquid assets. He had to refinance a portion of his business assets to meet it. Additionally, at Priya's recommendation, we referred the business account documentation to the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office. Whether or not they chose to pursue criminal charges was not within our control, but the referral was made, formally and completely, with Howard's full report attached. They pursued it. A criminal investigation into financial irregularities at Holloway Property Services was opened in February. My father was not arrested that week or that month, but the investigation itself was, again, a matter of record, and Gary Pratt's ability to keep it quiet was limited by the fact that it was happening. There is a particular quality to the light in January in the Chicago suburbs that I have always found honest. There is nowhere to hide in that light. No warmth softening the edges, no haze, just flat gray sky and bare trees and everything visible exactly as it is. I drove out to Plainfield on a Saturday in late January, the day after the property transfer was formally recorded, and I sat in the parking lot of a coffee shop on Route 59, and I looked at the address on the deed that was now unambiguously mine, and I thought about Grandma Loretta deciding, when I was 17, to give me something that she knew I would need. She had seen it coming before I had. She had tried to leave me a foundation when I had no idea I was going to need one. I got out of my car and I walked to the property. It was a 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet street, cream-colored siding, a front porch with 2 wooden steps. The current tenant, a man named Dale who had been renting it for 3 years, answered the door with the expression of someone who expected a problem and found none. I told him I was the owner and that I wanted to introduce myself and that nothing was changing regarding his tenancy. He shook my hand and offered me a coffee, and I sat in his kitchen for half an hour, and we talked about the neighborhood and the winters and whether the furnace was reliable. The furnace was reliable. It had just been serviced. He was a decent man who had been unwittingly living in the middle of a theft he had no knowledge of. I drove home that afternoon with the radio off and the heat on, and I thought about what it had taken to get here. Vanessa called me in March. I let it go to voicemail twice and then answered the 3rd time because I had decided I was not going to spend the rest of my life arranging avoidances. She was crying, which she rarely did. Vanessa had learned from the same family I had that emotion was a liability, and she was not doing the performance of crying that some people do, the kind designed to generate a response. She was genuinely distressed in a way that I recognized as authentic because it sounded like me in the apartment 11 years ago, the 2 hours before I went back to work. She said, "I didn't know about any of it." I said, "I know you didn't know about the property or the trust account. You knew some other things, and you chose not to look at them." She was quiet for a long time. I said, "You told our parents I dropped out. You didn't ask me first. You didn't call me. You went straight to them with a story you didn't have the full picture of, and you let them use it." She said, "I thought I was being honest." I said, "You thought you were the good daughter. You know the difference." More silence. And then she said very quietly, "Yes, I know the difference." That was the most honest thing Vanessa had said to me in perhaps 20 years. And I want to tell you that it moved something in me, because it did. Not into forgiveness, not yet, and not easily, and not completely. But it moved something. Because there is a particular specific loneliness in being the wrong daughter that does not get enough credit. It is not just about the father or the mother. It is about the sister. About growing up in the same house with someone who had the same raw material and made different choices, and not knowing whether those choices were cowardice or strategy or simply the path of least resistance, and not being able to ask because asking would cost you something you couldn't afford to spend. I told Vanessa that I needed time, real time, not a phone call. That if she wanted a relationship with me, it would need to be built differently than the one we'd had, and that I wasn't willing to construct a sisterhood on a foundation of things we'd agreed not to look at. She said she understood. I told her I'd reach out when I was ready. I meant it. That was 19 months before the ceremony. I should tell you what the ceremony was, because the way the world arranged it was something I could not have planned if I had tried. Groundwork Pro had expanded in the 3 years after the settlement. We had licensing agreements with property services companies in 14 states, and in the summer of that year we had been acquired by a mid-sized software company based in Chicago, for a figure I will describe as enough that I no longer thought about money the way I used to think about it. I had stayed on as the VP of Product Development and had been working with the acquirer to expand the platform into municipal property management, a pilot program of which had been running in the Chicago Metro for 8 months with strong results. The city of Naperville, my city, the suburb where I grew up, where my father had built his reputation and my mother had organized the church fundraiser and my family had the right lawn, had an annual Business and Community Achievement Award called the Meridian Award, given by the mayor at a ceremony held each spring at the Naperville Marriott. It was a real thing, not a ceremonial token. Local business owners and community members attended, civic organizations, the Chamber of Commerce. A room of people who knew the landscape of this specific place and took genuine pride in it. I had been nominated for the Meridian Award in the Technology and Innovation category for Groundwork Pro's municipal pilot program. I had not told my parents. I had told exactly 3 people, Priya, Howard, and Dr. Osi. My mother and father were in that room. My father was still living in Naperville. The settlement had damaged him financially and the investigation had damaged him socially, but he had not left. He had lost 2 major commercial clients who cited, through their lawyers, a decision to review vendor relationships in light of ongoing litigation, which was language for. We heard what happened and were not comfortable. He had laid off 4 employees. He had sold one of the company vehicles. He was still operating, diminished and quiet, in the way that people who have built an identity around their reputation operate when that reputation has developed a visible crack. My mother had not called me since the settlement was finalized. She had sent one text message, 7 words, "I hope you're satisfied with what you've done." I had not responded. They were at the ceremony because the Meridian Award was the kind of civic event that my father had attended for 25 years, the kind of room where his presence used to mean something, the kind of room he could not yet bring himself to stop entering even though it was no longer the room it had been for him. I was seated at a round table toward the front with Priya on my left and a city council member named Janelle Reyes on my right, who had been one of the champions of the municipal pilot program, and who had become, over the months of working together, someone I was genuinely glad to know. The room smelled like hotel carpet and warm bread from the dinner service, and there were centerpieces of white hydrangeas on every table. And the mayor of Naperville was a man named Thomas Calloway, who had a precise, warm delivery that I had come to appreciate in the several meetings we'd had through the program work. When Mayor Calloway read my name for the Technology and Innovation Award, he said it fully. Claire Renata Holloway, founder of Groundwork Pro and architect of the city's new property services management platform, whose work has saved the city an estimated $900,000 in administrative overhead in its first year of implementation. $900,000. He said that in a room full of people who knew what a dollar meant in municipal budgets, and the room reacted accordingly. I heard it. The catch in the ambient sound of the room. Not silence, exactly, but that particular collective pause when something lands with impact. And I looked up from the table and I found my parents across the room in approximately 4 seconds, because I knew where they sat. I had noted it when I came in, and I saw my mother's face. She had gone very still. She was holding her wine glass, and she was not drinking from it, and her eyes were on the front of the room where I was standing up to accept the award, and her expression was the expression of someone who has just been shown something and cannot decide how to arrange their face around it. My father was not looking at the front of the room. He was looking at the table. I walked to the podium and Mayor Calloway shook my hand and gave me the award, a glass piece, heavy, clean-lined, simple and substantial. And I stood at the microphone and I looked at the room. My room. The room I grew up adjacent to. The room that had heard the name Holloway for 30 years and associated it with Richard. I said, I want to thank the city of Naperville and Mayor Calloway for this recognition. I grew up in this community and I know what it means to do something here that lasts. I built Groundwork Pro because I saw a problem that wasn't being solved and I believed I could solve it. I'm grateful for everyone who has been part of that work. That was my speech. 33 seconds. I had written it with exactly the economy I wanted. I did not thank my family. I did not thank my parents. I thanked the city and the team, and I said I had built the thing because I believed I could. I walked back to my table and Priya put her hand on my arm and squeezed once and said nothing. And Janelle Reyes leaned over and said, well deserved. And I set the glass award on the table in front of me. And I breathed slowly for about 30 seconds and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a very long time. After the ceremony, in the lobby, while people were gathering coats and saying their goodbyes, my mother found me. She came through the crowd with a deliberate pace, not hurrying, and she stopped in front of me with about 3 feet between us, and she looked at me in the way she looked when she was deciding something. She was 61 years old, and she was beautifully dressed in a cream blouse and dark slacks, and her hair was exactly right, and she looked from the outside exactly as she had always looked, composed and careful and aware of how she appeared. She said, congratulations. 1 word. 1 syllable, 1 syllable, 4 syllables, 1 syllable. I had rehearsed nothing for this because I had not known it was coming. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about 33 years, about $26,000 in student loans while my sister's tuition was paid, about the phone call where she said disgrace, about 7 words in a text after a legal settlement, about all the ways a mother can tell a daughter what she is worth and all the ways she had used every single one. I said, thank you. And then, I'll see you around, Mom. I turned and walked back to Priya, and we left together, and I did not look back across the lobby to see if my mother was watching. She was. I found out later from someone who had been standing nearby, but by then I was already in the car. The criminal investigation into my father's business accounts concluded that September with a plea agreement. He was charged with 1 count of financial exploitation in the context of a fiduciary relationship, a Class 3 felony in Illinois, and 1 count of improper handling of estate assets. The plea was negotiated to avoid trial. He pled guilty to the estate assets count as a Class 4 felony, received a sentence of 30 months probation, a fine of $42,000, and was ordered to complete 60 hours of financial restitution compliance monitoring through the state. He lost his business license for 2 years. Holloway Property Services, which had operated for 31 years, was formally dissolved in November. 31 years. Gone. Not because I was angry, because the documentation was irrefutable and the system did, in the end, exactly what it is designed to do when someone puts the right materials in front of it with the right precision and the right preparation. My father is 64 now, and he lives in a smaller house in Aurora, about 20 minutes from where I grew up. He did not reach out to me after the plea. I did not reach out to him. I have no plans to. That is not cruelty. That is proportion. He spent years treating my existence as a liability, and my grandmother's inheritance as his personal operating fund, and the consequence is that he now lives a smaller life in a smaller house with a criminal record and a dissolved company and a reputation that no longer opens doors in the community he built it in. I feel nothing that resembles guilt about that outcome. I feel that it is, to the greatest extent the law and civil process allowed, what was warranted. My mother still lives in the Naperville house. She and my father have separated, not formally divorced at last count, but living apart with a distance that has the texture of permanence. She did not choose to fight the legal proceedings. She did not intervene. She was, in the end, the kind of woman who makes choices by not choosing, who stands at a moral intersection and looks at her feet and calls it neutrality. She is not neutral. She was never neutral. But she is also not my problem to solve. I reach out to her once or twice a year, a birthday call, a text at Christmas. I do not go home. If she needs something practical, something real, I would probably help her because I am not constructed to watch someone suffer when I have the ability to reduce suffering. But I do not owe her closeness and I do not manufacture it. What we have is what she made of it, and it is exactly as thin as it deserves to be. Vanessa and I have talked, carefully and slowly, over the past 19 months. She is not the person she was in the hallway at 26 watching our mother pack my boxes and saying nothing. She has been in therapy, her own therapist, her own work, nothing I suggested or organized, which was important. She reached out to me in that March call, and then she kept reaching out, and each time she did, it was more honest than the time before. She told me, in a conversation last summer over lunch at a place in Lincoln Square, that she had understood on some level what was happening with the favoritism when we were growing up, and had made a calculation that she was not proud of. She said it plainly, without excessive emotion, and she took responsibility for it without performing remorse in a way designed to make me feel obligated to reassure her. That was the first conversation we'd had as adults that didn't have a false floor. We are not close in the way we might have been. We are figuring out what we are. It is slow and it is real and it is on terms I chose, which means it is the first thing between us that ever has been. I am 35 years old now. I live in a condo in Andersonville on the north side of Chicago. 1,200 square feet, high ceilings, a kitchen I actually use, bookshelves I filled myself. The Plainfield property has a new tenant, a woman named Rosario who works at the school district and has 2 kids who ride their bikes on the sidewalk out front. I've met her twice and she sends me a note every time something needs fixing, which I always take care of promptly because it is her home and she deserves that. The property is mine and I intend to keep it. I still have Grandma Loretta's compass. It lives on my desk now, not in my pocket. I don't need to carry it anymore because I know which direction I'm facing. Priya and I have dinner every few weeks, usually on a Tuesday because we both find Tuesdays underrated, at a Thai place in Ravenswood where the owner knows our order and brings it without being asked. Howard sent me a congratulatory text when the plea was announced. One line, classic Howard. The money said what it needed to say, and I saved it because it perfectly encapsulates the man. Dr. Show. OC and I now meet monthly rather than weekly, which is its own kind of progress marker. I am not going to tell you that I wake up every morning feeling healed, because that is not how this works. There are mornings when I pour my coffee and think about being 11 years old and having the wrong test score and watching my sister's paper go on the refrigerator, and I feel the specific small ache of it. I do not think I will stop feeling that. I do not think I am supposed to. It is the accurate emotional memory of what happened, and it belongs to me, and I would not trade it for the false peace of having rewritten the story into something more comfortable. What I have instead of comfort is clarity. I know what happened. I know what I did about it. I know what it cost them and what it gave me. I know that every resource I now have, the condo, the career, the platform that $900,000 in 1 year, the award on a shelf in my office, the property in Plainfield, the relationships I chose and built and kept, every one of those things came from me. From the intelligence and stubbornness and careful, relentless work of a woman who was told she was a disgrace and decided that wasn't the final word on the matter. I want to tell you something that I spent a long time learning, and that I hope you will hear, wherever you're watching this from, whatever room you're in right now, whatever table you're sitting at, that has your own version of a wrong test score on the refrigerator, or a sister who said the wrong thing, or a parent who used money as a substitute for love and a weapon in place of respect. The first thing is this. The story they told about you is not the story. Their version of you is not you. It is what they needed you to be so that the rest of the architecture would hold. You do not have to carry it. You can set it down and walk forward and the world will not correct you. The world will, in time, show you a version of yourself that they never intended you to see. The second thing is that planning is love. The years I spent quietly documenting, building, preparing, reaching out to Priya and Howard and Dr. Osei, those were not years of revenge fantasy or obsession. Those were years of taking seriously the life I had been given and deciding it deserved to be defended. You are allowed to take your life seriously. You are allowed to build the case. You are allowed to bring the documents to the table and let the truth do its job. The third thing is the one that took me longest. You do not need to be forgiven for protecting yourself. I have never apologized for filing that complaint. I have never apologized for the settlement. I have never apologized for the referral to the state's attorney's office. Some people in our extended family have expressed discomfort with what I did, the sense that family business should stay family business, that there was a more graceful or private way to handle it. And I understand that perspective because I was raised inside the same cultural expectation that privacy protects dignity, and that washing laundry in public is its own form of disgrace. But here is what I know. What my father did was not a private matter between us. He committed a breach of fiduciary duty and a financial crime, and those things have legal names, and the law exists precisely so that people who commit them face consequences that are proportional and documentable and real. I used the law. It worked. And I will not apologize for using the tools that exist to protect people like me, just because using them made the rest of the family uncomfortable. There is a Tuesday morning in early spring that I keep coming back to in my memory as the image of what I built toward, though I didn't know it was what I was building toward when I was in the middle of everything. It was about 6 weeks after the plea was entered, so the legal process had finally completed, and I had woken up early without an alarm, which is a thing my body does now that it didn't used to do. Because for years, my body had not trusted sleep enough to wake up naturally. It always needed the external interrupt. I made coffee, Ethiopian Yirgacheffe, because I had decided some time ago that I was done tolerating bad coffee, and I opened the windows because it was warm enough, finally, and sat on the small square of my balcony with the mug in both hands and the city waking up below me, the particular slow sounds of a Tuesday morning in a residential neighborhood, a garbage truck 2 blocks north, a dog somewhere, a person running on the sidewalk with earbuds in. I sat there for 40 minutes and thought about nothing in particular. Just the coffee and the air and the sounds and the light. Not solving anything, not documenting anything, not planning anything. Just being in a life that was entirely mine. In a morning I had not had to negotiate with anyone to have, with no one's assessment of my worth anywhere in the room. That is what I fought for. Not the award or the settlement or the property or even the legal vindication, though all of those things mattered. I fought for the Tuesday morning, the coffee, the open window, the absence of anyone telling me what I was allowed to be. I earned that morning. I want you to know that you can earn yours. If this story woke something in you, if at any point you thought this sounds like my house, this sounds like my table, this sounds like something I have been carrying for too long, leave your comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and tell me what hit you hardest. I want to hear from you because this is not a story about one woman. It is a story about every person who has been made to feel that their worth is conditional, that they must earn love from the people who were supposed to give it freely, that they owe silence to people who never extended them the same courtesy. You do not owe your silence. Not to your father, not to your mother, not to a sibling who kept their hands in their pockets while you absorbed the damage. You owe your life, the real one, the full one, the one that has your name on it, exactly the respect and protection that you would give to someone you love completely. That someone is you. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because there are more stories here. Stories about people who stopped accepting less, who built their cases, who used the systems available to them, and walked out into lives that belonged to them. Stories about people who got out not because they waited for permission, but because they decided they were done waiting. There is a limit to what you are required to tolerate. That limit is yours to set, and you have every right to enforce it.